January 17th, 1945. Houffalize, Belgium. The forest floor trembled beneath 400 tons of steel. Snow-dusted fir trees swayed as if caught in an invisible storm, their branches shedding powder in slow cascades that caught the pale pre-dawn light. In the frozen mud of the Ardennes, a German panzergrenadier pressed his ear against the crystallized earth and felt it, a deep, rhythmic pulse that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Not the familiar growl of panzer engines he had known since Kursk. Something else, something heavier. The sound carried through the ground like a funeral drumbeat, steady and inevitable, growing louder with each passing second, until it drowned out even the distant artillery thunder that had become the permanent soundtrack of winter 1945. He raised his head and squinted through the morning mist that clung to the valley like smoke from extinguished campfires. There, emerging from the tree line 300 meters distant, came shapes that defied the logic of armored warfare as he understood it. Not the lean, predatory silhouettes of tigers or panthers, nor the familiar box-like profiles of Churchill or Sherman tanks. These were fortresses on tracks, moving with an unhurried confidence that spoke of absolute certainty. Their hulls sat low and wide, turrets rotating with mechanical precision, gun barrels long enough to seem almost comical extending from their mantlets. The panzergrenadier counted 7, then 12, then stopped counting. They kept coming, an iron tide that reflected no light, absorbed no shadow, simply existed as solid facts against the winter landscape. Behind him, in a hastily camouflaged Panther tank, Oberfeldwebel Klaus Richter lifted his field glasses and felt his stomach tighten. 22 months of war had taught him to recognize every Allied tank on sight. The dependable but vulnerable Sherman, the lumbering British Churchills, even the rare Soviet T-34s that occasionally appeared in intelligence photographs. But these machines matched nothing in his mental catalog. He watched one navigate a bomb crater without slowing, its tracks churning through frozen earth with contemptuous ease, and realized with the sudden clarity of combat veterans that every assumption about American armor he had carried since North Africa was about to be violently disproven. Ist das, whispered his loader, Corporal Steiner, a Silesian farm boy who had once believed in invincible German steel. The question hung in the cold air, unanswered. What were they, indeed? The Americans had a name for them, though the Germans would not learn it until prisoners were taken days later. The M26 Pershing heavy tank. But names mattered little in that frozen moment. What mattered was tonnage and armor thickness, kinetic energy and penetration values, the brutal mathematics of armored warfare that cared nothing for propaganda or patriotic speeches. Richter had laughed 3 days earlier when intelligence briefings mentioned new American heavy armor, laughed because laughter was easier than acknowledging the creeping dread that had infected every Wehrmacht soldier who still possessed the capacity for honest thought. The Americans, they had been told repeatedly, were mechanically competent but doctrinally inferior, good at producing vast quantities of adequate equipment but incapable of matching German engineering brilliance. Their Shermans burned so readily that German tank crews had nicknamed them Ronsons, after the cigarette lighter that advertised "Lights first time, every time." American tanks were mobile coffins, traveling bonfires, metal tombs that offered their crews up for slaughter against the superior gunnery and armor of German panzers. These beliefs, cultivated through 3 years of increasingly desperate defensive warfare, had sustained morale even as the Reich contracted like a dying star. If German armor was qualitatively superior, and it was, wasn't it? Then numerical disadvantage could be overcome through tactical excellence and technological supremacy. It was a comfortable lie, warm as a wool blanket, necessary as morphine. And now that lie was driving toward them at 15 kilometers per hour. wrapped in 90 millimeters of face-hardened steel, mounting a 90 millimeter gun whose ballistic performance Richter could not yet comprehend but would soon understand with terrible intimacy. The mythology of German armored invincibility had been born in different fields, on different frontiers. It emerged from the rolling grasslands of France in 1940, when Guderian's panzers had sliced through defensive lines that generals had promised were impregnable. It solidified in the vast spaces of Russia in 1941, when Tiger tanks first appeared and seemed to justify every propaganda claim about German technical genius. By 1943, that mythology had calcified into dogma, repeated in every barracks and training facility. German armor was the finest in the world, German crews the most skilled, German doctrine the most innovative. Evidence to the contrary was dismissed as statistical anomaly, or attributed to overwhelming enemy numbers, never to qualitative parity, never to the possibility that other nations might learn, might adapt, might produce something genuinely superior. But mythology fractures when it meets reality at high velocity. And reality, on that January morning in Belgium, wore olive-drab paint and carried American markings. The Pershings advanced in textbook formation, AEE, wedge that suggested doctrinal sophistication far beyond what German intelligence had credited to. American armor commanders, their movement was coordinated, professional, the kind of tactical execution that came from either extensive combat experience or exceptional training. Richter knew, from captured documents and interrogation reports, that American armored doctrine had evolved significantly since the disasters of 1942. They had studied Kasserine Pass the way medical students studied cadavers, dissecting every failure until they understood the anatomy of defeat. They had noted every engagement in Normandy where Shermans had burned, catalogued every ambush in the Bocage where German anti-tank guns had turned American columns into scrap metal and mourning telegrams. And then, with the kind of industrial determination that characterized everything about the American war effort, they had built something better. The M26 Pershing represented a philosophical shift in American armor design, away from the doctrine of mobility and numerical superiority toward a recognition that sometimes you needed to meet enemy heavy armor on equal terms. Its 90mm gun could penetrate the frontal armor of a Tiger I at 1,000 meters. Its own frontal armor, sloped at carefully calculated angles, could defeat the famous German 88mm at all but point-blank range. It weighed 46 tons, nearly equal to a Panther, and carried sufficient automotive power to maintain mobility despite that mass. In the brutal calculus of armored combat, it was a statement. We can build tanks as good as yours. Better, actually. And we can build them in quantities you cannot match. But Richter did not know these specifications as he watched the Pershings approach. He knew only that their movement suggested mass, real, substantial mass, and that their turrets tracked potential threats with disconcerting speed. His own Panther mounted an excellent 75mm gun, capable of defeating most Allied armor at comfortable ranges. But comfortable ranges required visibility, firing angles, the luxury of prepared positions. The Pershings were not offering such luxuries. They were coming straight on, through terrain that channeled defenders into predictable kill zones, and they moved like machines that did not fear German guns. Range? Richter asked his gunner, a Bavarian named Hoffmann, who had survived Kursk and learned to respect Soviet armor even when propaganda insisted he should not. 1,100 meters and closing. Angle is poor. We need them to turn. They won't turn. Then we fire now, or we don't fire at all. Richter made the calculation every tank commander makes when confronted with unknown armor. Shoot or displace, engage or evade. The equation involved factors both tactical and psychological. Tactically, his Panther held the advantage of a concealed position and first shot opportunity. Psychologically, withdrawal without engaging would corrode what remained of his crew's confidence faster than Russian winter corroded steel. But there was a third element, one he felt rather than analyzed, the sense that these American tanks were different, that engaging them might reveal his position without achieving the decisive result German doctrine demanded. The decision was made for him. A kilometer to his left, another Panther broke concealment and fired. The distinctive crack of a German 75 mm or tank gun split the morning, followed by the sound every tanker dreads: the metallic clang of a solid shot striking armor and failing to penetrate. Richter watched through his optics as the round sparked off the glacis plate of the lead Pershing, deflecting upward at an angle that suggested the American armor was not merely thick, but intelligently sloped. The Pershing didn't stop, didn't slew aside, didn't exhibit any of the panic responses inexperienced crews displayed when taking fire. It simply rotated its turret with mechanical precision and returned fire. What happened next violated every assumption about American gunnery that German crews had accumulated. The Pershing's 90 mm gun spoke once, a deeper, heavier report than the Sherman's 75 mm, and the German Panther that had fired first simply ceased to exist as a functional combat vehicle. There was no dramatic explosion, no Hollywood fireball. The American round punched through the Panther's frontal armor at a point just beside the gun mantlet, supposedly one of the strongest areas of the tank, and detonated the ready ammunition stored inside. The German tank settled on its suspension like a dying animal, smoke pouring from every hatch, and became instantly irrelevant to the remainder of the battle. 5 seconds. From detection to destruction. 5 seconds. Richter had seen Soviet T-34s destroyed faster, had witnessed the horrifying efficiency of German 80 mm guns reducing Allied armor to burning wrecks in the time it took to inhale. But this was different. This was American armor, the armor German propaganda had taught him to dismiss, demonstrating gunnery and penetration that matched or exceeded the best German tanks. And they had done it while moving, while under fire, with the kind of casual competence that suggested extensive training and complete confidence in their equipment. The mythology fractured further. A second German tank fired, a Panzer IV commanded by a Lieutenant Mannheim, a veteran of the Eastern Front who had survived Stalingrad and believed himself unkillable. His shot struck the turret of a Pershing at 900 meters and ricocheted into the sky, leaving only a scar in the American paint. The Pershing's response was immediate and terminal. 90 millimeters of tungsten-cored death crossed the intervening space in less than a second and turned Mannheim's tank into a monument to the end of German armored supremacy. The round penetrated the Panzer IV's thin frontal armor, passed through the fighting compartment, and exited through the rear plate, killing the entire crew before they could even comprehend their failure. Richter understood, in that moment, that the battle was already lost. Not this particular engagement, that had been lost the moment the Pershings appeared, but something larger, the strategic assumption that German technical superiority could offset Allied numerical and industrial advantages, the comfortable belief that one Tiger could defeat 5 Shermans, the entire psychological architecture that had sustained Wehrmacht morale through 2 years of continuous retreat. All of it was burning in those smoking German hulls, revealed as fiction by the simple existence of American tanks that could fight German armor on equal or superior terms. "Reverse," he ordered, slowly. "Don't break concealment until we're behind the ridge." His crew obeyed with the smooth coordination of men who had survived this long by trusting their commander's instincts. The Panther crept backward, its engine purring in low gear, withdrawing from a fight it could not win against an enemy it had been taught to underestimate. As they displaced, Richter watched 3 more Pershings enter his field of view, followed by infantry in half-tracks, followed by the inevitable tide of logistics vehicles that characterized every American advance. Not just tanks, then. A combined arms assault, supported by artillery, he could hear ranging on German positions 2 kilometers east, coordinated by radio networks whose reliability German signals officers envied, sustained by supply chains that extended unbroken across the Atlantic Ocean. This was the real horror the Pershing represented, not just a better tank, though it was that, but proof that American industrial capacity could produce quality and quantity simultaneously. Germany had always faced the choice: build smaller numbers of excellent weapons or larger numbers of adequate ones. The Americans, with their bewildering abundance, simply built everything. Thousands of Shermans, hundreds of Pershings, enough artillery to flatten entire landscapes, enough trucks to keep every unit supplied, enough of everything to make German commanders' heads spin when they reviewed captured logistics documents. Oberleutnant Werner Vogel had mocked those documents 3 weeks earlier. Vogel commanded the Panzer Company dug in along the ridge, a Prussian aristocrat who wore his Iron Cross First Class like a religious icon, and spoke about American soldiers with the kind of contempt usually reserved for cowards and traitors. "They are shopkeepers playing at war," he had announced over schnapps in the command bunker. "Their tanks are assembly line products, mass-produced by factory workers who have never seen combat. Our panzers are crafted by skilled engineers, tested in the fires of the Eastern Front. When they meet our steel, their inferior metal will fold like paper." Vogel's tank had been among the first destroyed that morning. Richter had seen it through his periscope. A momentary flash as a Pershing's round penetrated the commander's cupola and detonated inside, turning the tank into an inferno that cooked off stored ammunition for 7 minutes. Vogel had time to scream, they said later, time to understand in his final seconds that contempt was not armor, and ideology could not stop kinetic energy traveling at 800 meters per second. The American crews driving those Pershings likely knew nothing of Vogel's contempt. They were, for the most part, young men from places called Ohio and Texas and Oregon, trained at facilities in Kentucky and California, shipped across the Atlantic in vessels that German U-boats could no longer effectively interdict. They had learned tank gunnery on ranges where ammunition was plentiful enough to actually practice, where instructors could afford to train them to competency rather than simply hoping innate German superiority would compensate for abbreviated training. They ate food that German soldiers fantasized about: real meat, fresh bread, chocolate bars that came in every ration pack, coffee that wasn't made from roasted grain substitutes. Richter had captured American rations once, back in September, during a brief counterattack near Aachen. He had opened a K-ration box and found more calories in that single meal than German soldiers often received in a day. Canned meat, crackers, cheese spread, chocolate, cigarettes, sugar tablets, chewing gum, instant coffee, even a tiny can opener on a chain. The sheer abundance was obscene, overwhelming, a physical manifestation of industrial capacity that Germany simply could not match. His men had fallen on those rations like starving dogs, consuming in minutes what American soldiers probably discarded as monotonous. And if American logistics could provide such abundance to front-line infantry, what could their industrial base provide to armored units? The Pershing gave him the answer. They could provide tanks whose armor matched German heavy tanks, guns that could penetrate anything Germany fielded, optics and fire control systems that worked, radios that didn't fail in cold weather, enough spare parts that breakdowns didn't permanently remove vehicles from service, enough fuel that tactical mobility wasn't a distant memory, enough of everything to fight the way doctrine textbooks described, rather than improvising with whatever happened to be available. The ridge behind which Richter's Panther sheltered offered a moment of safety, a breathing space to reassess and report. Through the vision blocks, he could see the remainder of his company, those tanks that had survived the initial contact, pulling back in ragged order. 9 Panthers had held this sector that morning. He counted 4 withdrawing. The mathematics of attrition were stark and final. In 5 minutes of combat, the Americans had destroyed more than half his company while suffering, from what he could observe, zero losses, not even a disabled track or damaged gun. This was the pattern repeating itself across every front where German forces still fought. In the Ardennes, where Hitler's last great offensive had shattered against American defenses and then been systematically destroyed by overwhelming Allied firepower. In Alsace, where French and American units were grinding through German fortifications with the inevitability of glaciers. In Italy, where the supposedly defensive line had become a slow hemorrhage of men and material. And in the East, always terribly in the East, where Soviet armies crushed German units with tactics learned from German teachers and weapons built in factories beyond the Urals that Luftwaffe bombers could no longer reach. The Americans called it Arsenal of Democracy, a phrase Richter had heard on captured propaganda broadcasts. It sounded like advertising copy, the kind of meaningless slogan democracies produced to motivate factory workers and justify rationing. But watching those Pershings advance through his former defensive line, he understood it as literal truth. Democracy, it turned out, was excellent at building things. Those American tank crews had voted for Roosevelt, presumably had participated in a political system that German ideology insisted was weak and decadent. Yet their system had produced these tanks, had created an industrial base capable of arming not just America, but Britain and the Soviet Union as well, had built Liberty ships faster than U-boats could, sink them and aircraft in numbers that turned the Luftwaffe into a nostalgic memory. Corporal Steiner broke the silence as their Panther reached the rally point. "They're better than us now, aren't they?" The Americans. It was not really a question. Richter did not pretend to misunderstand. "Yes. How long have they been better?" "I don't know. Months, maybe. Since Normandy, perhaps. We just didn't notice because we were fighting mostly Shermans, and the Shermans are still vulnerable. But these—" He gestured vaguely toward the ridge, where the sounds of battle continued. "These are what they can build when they decide to build something good." Hoffman, the gunner, lit a cigarette with shaking hands. "We were told American tanks were garbage. Rolling coffins. Easy kills?" "Shermans are easy kills," Richter replied. "These aren't Shermans." It was a distinction that mattered enormously. The Sherman tank, the M4 medium tank that formed the backbone of American armored forces, had been designed in 1941 according to a doctrine that emphasized mobility and mass production over armor protection or gunpowder. It was, in many ways, an excellent tank for 1942. But by 1944, it was outclassed by German heavy armor, a fact that American tankers learned at terrible cost in Normandy's bocage and Lorraine's mud. The Sherman's 75mm gun could barely penetrate a Panther's frontal armor. Its own armor was vulnerable to every German anti-tank weapon, its tendency to burn when penetrated, a result of ammunition storage and gasoline. Engines had earned it those grim nicknames from both sides, but the Sherman had never been meant to fight Tigers and Panthers alone. American doctrine called for Shermans to bypass heavy armor when possible, leaving tank destroyers and artillery to deal with German heavies. It was sound doctrine when it worked. When it didn't work, Sherman crews died in numbers that shocked even hardened veterans. By late 1944, American armored officers were screaming for better tanks, for something that could fight German armor on equal terms rather than relying on 5-to-1 numerical advantages and inevitable casualties. The Pershing was the Army's answer to those screams. Late, perhaps later than necessary, but better than any previous American tank. It had been designed to match the Panther and defeat the Tiger, and from what Richter had just witnessed, it succeeded admirably at both missions. More than that, it represented a maturation of American military thinking. The Americans had studied their failures, adapted their doctrine, and produced a weapon system that incorporated lessons learned from 3 years of armored combat. This was not shopkeepers playing at war. This was a nation that learned faster than Germany could adapt. The radio crackled. Orders to fall back to secondary positions reform what remained of the battle group, prepare to defend against American exploitation of the breakthrough. Richter acknowledged and put his Panther in gear, joining the retreat that had become Germany's only military operation. As they moved through muddy farm roads and shattered villages, he passed the detritus of Wehrmacht collapse, abandoned trucks, dead horses, columns of hollow-eyed infantry who looked up without hope as the tank rumbled past. These men had believed the propaganda too, believed that German soldiers were better, German weapons superior, German will unbreakable. Now they were learning the truth, one bloody mile at a time. By nightfall, Richter's company, what remained of it, had established positions in a pine forest 8 kilometers from their morning starting point. 4 Panthers, from an original 9. 11 men dead, 6 wounded badly enough to be evacuated. And for what? They had delayed the American advance by perhaps 2 hours, killed no American tanks that Richter could confirm, and sacrificed 5 excellent tanks whose replacements would never arrive. The strategic value was nil, the tactical impact meaningless, but such was warfare in the winter of 1945, fighting not to win, because winning was no longer possible but to delay the inevitable, to buy time for, what? A miracle weapon? Political collapse among the Allies? German soldiers no longer knew. They fought because the alternative was surrender. And surrender meant admitting that everything, all the sacrifice, all the death, all the propaganda, had been for nothing. In his tank that night, while Steiner heated ersatz coffee over a tiny stove, and Hoffman wrote a letter home that would probably never be mailed, Richter pulled out a creased photograph. His wife and daughter in their Hamburg apartment, taken in the summer of 1939 when the world still made sense. Hamburg was rubble now, he knew, destroyed by British bombers and American incendiaries, burned in firestorms that had killed tens of thousands. His wife and daughter had evacuated to her parents' farm in Bavaria, which meant they were probably still alive, probably safe from the Red Army that was crushing toward Berlin from the east. But what would their lives be like when this ended? What Germany would they inhabit when the Americans and British and Russians finished carving up the Reich? He thought about those American tankers in their Pershings, advancing through Belgium with confidence born of superior equipment and unlimited supply. They probably had similar photographs in their pockets: wives, girlfriends, mothers, children. The difference was that their families were safe, living in places called Chicago and Dallas and Philadelphia, cities that had never seen bomb craters or rubble piles, where you could buy coffee and chocolate and gasoline without ration cards, where the war was newspaper headlines and newsreels between Hollywood movies. Those American soldiers were fighting to end a war and go home. German soldiers were fighting because their homes were already destroyed, and surrender meant facing what they had done, what had been done in their names, in 100 occupied territories across Europe. The Pershing was more than a tank. It was a symbol of that disparity, the gap between a nation that could afford to design, test, manufacture, and field new heavy armor in the middle of a global war, and a nation that was cannibalizing its own civilian infrastructure for raw materials to keep fighting. Germany was melting down church bells to make shell casings, while America was producing tanks in former automobile factories and churning out aircraft faster than pilots could be trained. The comparison was so lopsided, it would have been funny if it weren't so absolutely lethal. 2 days later, Richter's company engaged more Pershings during a desperate counterattack ordered by commanders who still believed that aggressive action could somehow reverse strategic collapse. The attack failed predictably. They destroyed 1 Pershing, a lucky shot into its thinner side armor at close range, and lost 2 more Panthers in exchange. The 1 Pershing they killed was recovered by American maintenance crews within hours, repaired, and back in action the next day. The Panthers burned in a field and would never be replaced. This was the war in miniature, Germany trading irreplaceable assets for temporary tactical gains, while America absorbed losses and kept coming. By February, the Pershing had become common enough in American armored units that German intelligence updated their recognition manuals and tactical directives. The new guidance was stark. The American M26 heavy tank possesses armor and armament equal to German heavy tanks. Frontal engagement should be avoided. Side and rear armor remain vulnerable. Recommended approach: ambush from concealment at close range. In other words, don't fight them unless you have overwhelming advantage, and even then, expect casualties. It was an extraordinary admission from an army that had spent 4 years proclaiming qualitative superiority. But the Pershing's technical specifications, impressive as they were, told only part of the story. The real impact was psychological, the way it shattered comfortable assumptions and forced German tank crews to confront their own vulnerability. For years, they had possessed the advantage: better armor, better guns, better optics. Even when outnumbered, even while retreating, they could take pride in their equipment's superiority. The Pershing stripped away that consolation. Now they were just soldiers in tanks, like any other soldiers, vulnerable to enemy fire, mortal and frightened, and aware that their equipment no longer gave them an edge. Richter felt it in his crew's demeanor. Steiner developed a nervous habit of checking their ammunition loads obsessively, as if confirming the presence of shells could somehow improve their penetrating power. Hoffman's gunnery, once confident and aggressive, became hesitant. He waited for perfect shots rather than firing on opportunity, afraid that anything less than ideal conditions would result in that terrible sound of rounds bouncing off American armor. The entire crew moved differently, spoke differently. The casual arrogance that had characterized German panzer crews in earlier years, the certainty that they were the best, their tanks unmatched, had evaporated like morning mist under the summer sun. This was happening in Panther and Tiger companies, across every front. Veteran crews who had destroyed dozens of Soviet T-34s and American Shermans now faced tanks that could kill them at ranges where they could be killed in return. The psychological equation of armored combat had shifted from "we can destroy them before they threaten us" to "this is a fair fight, and fair fights mean people die." German tactical doctrine had always emphasized avoiding fair fights, using superior equipment and positioning to create unfair advantages. But advantages required superiority, and superiority required better tanks. The Pershing proved that America could build better tanks, which meant German tactical doctrine was based on an assumption that was no longer valid. In March, Richter's Panther was finally destroyed, not by a Pershing, but by a rocket-firing Typhoon fighter bomber that caught his platoon moving in daylight. He and his crew survived, walking 30 kilometers through Allied lines before being captured by American infantry near the Rhine. The MP who processed them spoke enough German to communicate, and Richter, exhausted and empty, asked about the Pershings. "How many did you build?" The Americans seemed surprised by the question. "Couple hundred made it to Europe before the war ended, I think." Not that many, really. 200. They had fundamentally altered the tactical calculus of the Western Front with 200 tanks. Not the thousands that propaganda had prepared German soldiers to expect, but a few hundred excellent weapons deployed to units that knew how to use them. Richter thought about those numbers in the POW camp, where German soldiers gathered in small groups, and tried to understand how it had all gone so wrong. 200 Pershings, probably 10,000 Shermans, tens of thousands of trucks and jeeps, unlimited artillery shells, food that came in packages designed by industrial chemists for maximum nutrition, cigarettes by the millions, coffee that was actual coffee, chocolate bars, gasoline in quantities that let American units maneuver without constantly worrying about fuel shortages. One of the other prisoners, a former Tiger commander named Bauer, had fought against Pershings near Cologne. "They're good tanks," he admitted, "but it's not the tanks that beat us. It's everything behind the tanks. The logistics, the spare parts, the fuel, the ammunition, the fact that when they lose a tank, they have another one the next day. When we lose a tank, it's just gone." He stared at the wire fence surrounding the camp. We were fighting the wrong war. We thought it was about courage and technical excellence. Turns out, it was about factories and supply chains. This was the truth that German soldiers confronted in those final months. That modern war was won by economic capacity more than battlefield valor, by industrial output more than tactical genius. The Pershing was simply the manifestation of that reality. A tank that proved American industry could produce quality as well as quantity. That democracy's weak economic system could outbuild fascism's efficient central planning. That the arsenal of democracy was not a slogan, but a literal description of unmatched industrial capacity. In the POW camp, Richter received a letter from his wife. Hamburg was occupied by British forces. Food was scarce but available. They were alive. Germany was divided, conquered, occupied by the same nations German propaganda had declared decadent and weak. The Reich that was supposed to last 1,000 years had collapsed in 12, and the Americans who guarded the camp gates, the soldiers who had driven those Pershings through German lines, were mostly just tired young men who wanted to go home, who passed out chocolate to German children and shared cigarettes with their prisoners, who treated captured soldiers with a casual decency that seemed utterly alien after years of Eastern Front brutality. There was a German word Richter learned in those months: Zusammenbruch, collapse, breakdown, the total failure of a system. It described Germany's military defeat, but also something deeper: the collapse of ideology, the breakdown of mythology, the total failure of every assumption that had sustained the Wehrmacht through 6 years of war. The Pershing was part of that collapse, a single-weapon system that symbolized the gap between what Germany had believed about itself and what was actually true. Years later, after he had returned to what remained of Hamburg and begun rebuilding a life from rubble and memory, Richter would occasionally see photographs of M26 Pershings in military history books. They looked almost quaint in retrospect. Superseded by Cold War tanks with better armor and more powerful guns, but he never forgot that January morning in Belgium, watching them emerge from the tree line with terrible confidence, each one a rolling refutation of everything he had been taught to believe. Not just about tanks, though certainly about tanks, about systems and ideologies and the relationship between economic capacity and military power. The American soldiers, who crewed those Pershings, probably never understood their symbolic importance to the Germans they fought. For them, the M26 was just a tank, better than a Sherman, sure, but still just a machine that could break down, get stuck, be destroyed by a lucky shot. They complained about its mechanical quirks, its tendency to throw tracks, the fact that it arrived too late to prevent earlier casualties. They were right to complain. The Pershing should have been fielded in 1943 or 1944. Might have saved thousands of American lives if it had been deployed earlier. But from the German perspective, even a few hundred Pershings represented something psychologically devastating. Proof that American industry could produce excellence on demand, that the quantitative advantage they had always known about was now married to qualitative parity or superiority. This was the real shock of the Pershing. Not that it was a good tank, though it was, but that it revealed American potential. If they could design and field a heavy tank that matched German heavy tanks in the middle of a global war, while simultaneously producing everything else their military needed, what couldn't they produce? What limits existed on American industrial capacity? The answer, as the post-war years would demonstrate, was that there were no meaningful limits. Not when the economy could expand to meet demand, not when natural resources were abundant, not when the civilian population was prosperous enough to buy war bonds and accept rationing without approaching starvation. Germany had mobilized its entire economy for total war, had stripped occupied territories of resources, had worked millions of slave laborers to death in fields and factories, and still could not match the industrial output of a United States that maintained relatively high civilian living standards throughout the conflict. This was the obscene truth that Pershing's represented, that democracy was not just morally superior, but practically more effective at modern warfare than fascism. All the propaganda about efficiency and will and superior ideology counted for nothing against an economic system that could produce both enormous quantities of adequate weapons and smaller quantities of excellent ones that could feed its soldiers real food and provide them with equipment that worked, that could absorb horrific casualties and keep fighting because the supply of men and material never ran dry. The mythology of German superiority, carefully cultivated through years of propaganda, had required that Allied weapons be inferior, not just somewhat worse, but dramatically, comfortingly worse. It required that American tanks be easy to destroy, that Allied soldiers be poorly trained, that democratic nations be too soft and decadent for sustained warfare. Every German success from 1939 to 1942 had seemed to confirm this mythology. But those successes had occurred against opponents who were unprepared, poorly equipped, or strategically surprised. France in 1940 had better tanks than Germany, but worse doctrine and communication. The Soviet Union in 1941 had been caught in the middle of military reorganization. These victories told German soldiers nothing about what would happen when they faced opponents who had learned from defeat, who had industrial capacity to produce excellent weapons, who had developed doctrine based on harsh experience rather than ideological assumptions. The Pershing was what happened. It was Allied nations learning faster than Germany could adapt, producing better weapons than German intelligence believed possible, deploying them with doctrine that reflected 3 years of costly education. And because it arrived in 1945, when the war was already decided, it served not as a decisive weapon, but as a symbol of what had been, what was, and what would be, of German mythology shattering against American steel, of ideology failing before industrial reality, of the moment when German tank crews looked across a battlefield and realized they no longer held any advantage except the rapidly diminishing capacity to die with whatever dignity defeat allowed. In the vast accounting of World War II, the Pershing was a footnote. It arrived too late to change strategic outcomes, destroyed relatively few German tanks, played no decisive role in any major battle. The war was won by earlier weapons, by millions of reliable Shermans and T-34s, by artillery and air power, by logistics networks and intelligence operations, and the simple arithmetic of attrition. But footnotes can reveal truth as clearly as headlines. The Pershing revealed that American capacity for military excellence had been constrained by doctrine and production priorities, not by industrial capability or engineering competence. It revealed that the gap between German and Allied armor, once so comfortable for German crews, had closed and reversed. And it revealed, to soldiers like Richter, who had believed the propaganda, that their entire understanding of the war had been fiction. The tank itself was just steel and mechanics, tungsten and optics. But what it represented, American abundance married to technical competence, democracy's industrial capacity fully engaged, a nation that could afford to develop and field new heavy armor even as the war approached its conclusion. That representation was devastating. It said, more clearly than any intelligence report or propaganda broadcast, you never had a chance. Your advantages were temporary, and your disadvantages permanent. We were always going to outbuild you, outproduce you, overwhelm you with material superiority that you could not match and could not stop. The only question was how long it would take, and how many would die before you understood. By the time German tank crews understood, it was far too late to matter. The Pershings kept coming, not in overwhelming numbers, but in sufficient quantities to shatter the comfortable illusion of German armored supremacy. Behind them came everything else: the infantry in their half-tracks, the artillery with ammunition to spare, the supply trucks filled with food and fuel and spare parts, the engineers with bridging equipment, the tank destroyers and anti-aircraft guns, and all the mundane components of modern combined arms warfare. It was an iron tide, relentless and inevitable, powered by an industrial base that German planning had underestimated by orders of magnitude. And in their POW camps and makeshift hospitals, in their shattered cities and occupied territories, German soldiers who had mocked American armor came to understand what they had been fighting. Not an inferior enemy handicapped by democratic softness, but a superpower that had chosen to fight with one hand while feeding the world with the other. The Americans had supplied Britain and the Soviet Union while arming themselves. They had maintained civilian prosperity while building the largest military in their history. They had developed atomic weapons, proximity fuses, radar networks, and code-breaking computers, while also producing more tanks, ships, and aircraft than anyone had thought possible. The Pershing was just one small piece of that overwhelming capacity, but it was the piece that German tank crews saw up close, that destroyed their vehicles and killed their comrades and made them understand, finally and completely, that they had never possessed the advantage they believed in. On the afternoon of January 17, 1945, as the Pershings pushed through German lines near Houffalize, a young American tank commander named Lieutenant Robert Early sat in his M26's turret and ate a chocolate bar from his K ration. He had no idea that German soldiers considered such rations evidence of obscene abundance. The chocolate was just chocolate, unremarkable, something he had been eating since childhood. His tank was just a tank. Better than the Sherman he had trained in, sure, but still a machine that could break down or take a lucky hit. He was fighting because he had been drafted, because his country was at war, because this was what Americans of his generation did. The ideological significance of his tank's armor and gun never occurred to him. He simply crewed the vehicle he was assigned, followed orders, and hoped to survive long enough to see Brooklyn again. But to Klaus Richter, watching from a concealed position before beginning his retreat, that American lieutenant represented something vast and terrible. He represented a nation that could fight a global war while eating chocolate, that could field new heavy armor while maintaining living standards German civilians had not known since 1939, that could produce excellence when needed and adequacy in quantities that overwhelmed Axis forces. Through sheer material weight, Early was just a soldier doing his job, but his job was made possible by an economic and industrial system that Germany could not match and could not defeat. This was the lesson of the Pershing, the truth it taught to those who were willing to learn, that modern war was won in factories as much as on battlefields, that economic capacity determined strategic outcomes, that ideology and propaganda could not substitute for industrial production and supply chain management. Germany had understood tactics and operational art. America had understood systems and logistics. In the end, logistics won, not because American soldiers were braver, though they were brave, and not because American tactics were better, though they improved dramatically. Logistics won because wars are fought with bullets and shells and fuel and food, and the side that has more of all those things will usually prevail if it can avoid catastrophic strategic errors. The Americans had avoided such errors, just barely. Through 1942 and 1943, they had learned from North Africa and Sicily and Italy. They had studied German tactics and developed counters. They had built the industrial capacity to equip a multi-million-man military while feeding allied nations and maintaining civilian prosperity. And when their tankers screamed for better armor, American industry had delivered. Late, perhaps, but delivered nonetheless. The Pershing was proof that democracy could respond to military necessity, could produce weapons that matched the best Axis equipment, could marry quantity and quality in ways that totalitarian economies struggling under strategic bombing and resource shortages simply could not replicate. In the symbolic language of armored warfare, the Pershing spoke clearly. The age of German armored dominance is over. The technical advantages you possessed have been studied, copied, and exceeded. Your industry cannot replace losses while ours operates at a tempo you cannot comprehend. Your supply lines are broken while ours stretch uninterrupted across oceans. Your soldiers are brave but exhausted while ours rotate out of combat for rest and refit. Nothing you believed about our weakness was true, and nothing you believed about your strength was sufficient. That message echoed across every battlefield where Pershings appeared, filtered through German tactical reports and prisoner interrogations and the grim mathematics of loss exchange ratios. It was heard in Berlin, where staff officers updated their estimates of Allied capabilities and watched their optimistic projections crumble into dust. It was felt by every panzer crew that encountered the new American heavy tanks and realized they no longer held an edge, that combat had become a contest of skill and luck rather than predetermined by superior equipment. And it was understood, eventually, by German leadership, though understanding came too late, when the war was already lost and comprehension brought only the bitter satisfaction of knowing why defeat had been inevitable. Third, Americans would produce more than 200 Pershings before war's end, not nearly enough to replace the Sherman as the primary American tank, but enough to equip selected units and provide a qualitative match for German heavy armor. After the war, the design would be refined and improved, becoming the basis for Cold War-era American tanks that would face Soviet armor in Korea and serve as the foundation for later generations of American armor development. But those future developments mattered little to the men who fought in 1945. For them, the Pershing was simply the tank that proved American industry could build whatever the military needed. That quantitative advantage could be paired with qualitative excellence. The democracy's inefficient economic system could outproduce fascism's efficient central planning in every category that mattered. Klaus Richter survived the war, survived the POW camps, survived the Reconstruction years when Germany was rubble and hunger and shame. He never crewed another tank. In the new West Germany, he worked in an automobile factory, ironic employment for a former panzer commander, building civilian vehicles in a nation that would never again field offensive armor. Sometimes, on assembly lines where Volkswagens rolled past with mechanical precision, he would think about Pershings emerging from Belgian tree lines, about the sounds and sensations of that January morning when mythology met reality and shattered. He never spoke about those memories. They were too personal, too painful, too revealing of the gap between what he had believed and what had been true. But the memories persisted. The deep rumble of those American tanks advancing, the casual confidence of their movement, the devastating effectiveness of their guns, the realization, cold and clear as winter dawn, that everything he had been taught was wrong, that German armor was not invincible, that American weapons were not inferior, that industrial capacity mattered more than tactical brilliance or ideological fervor. The Pershing had taught him truths that peacetime Germans did not want to hear, truths about the war and about Germany's place in it. So he kept silent and built cars and tried not to remember the morning when his comfortable assumptions had burned along with his comrades in their Panther tanks. Decades later, military historians would debate the Pershing's significance, whether it arrived too late to matter, whether its deployment affected tactical outcomes, whether earlier introduction might have reduced American casualties. These were legitimate questions, answerable through careful analysis of deployment records and combat reports. But they missed the deeper significance, the psychological impact of a weapon system that proved Allied industrial capacity could produce excellence when needed. The Pershing mattered not because it won battles. Single-handedly, it didn't. But because it represented the closing of a gap that German strategy had required remain open if the Americans and British and Soviets could only field inferior equipment in overwhelming quantities, then German tactical and technical excellence might offset strategic disadvantages. But if Allied nations could field superior equipment in overwhelming quantities, then German advantages evaporated completely. The Pershing, along with weapons like the Soviet IS-2 Keter-13, a TUI heavy tank and improved British armor, proved that Allied industrial capacity could produce anything German industry could produce, and do so while maintaining production of adequate weapons at scales Germany could never match. This was the nightmare scenario German strategic planning had refused to acknowledge. Qualitative parity combined with quantitative superiority, rendering German tactical excellence irrelevant against overwhelming material advantage. And so, the Pershings rolled through Belgium and across the Rhine, symbols of industrial power and democratic resilience, carrying crews who ate chocolate and complained about mechanical reliability while demolishing the last comfortable myths of German armored invincibility. They were not war-winning weapons, arriving too late for that, but they were myth-destroying weapons, perfect tools for teaching the final lesson of World War II. That modern warfare was industrial warfare, that abundance mattered more than ideology, that a nation which could afford to field new, heavy tanks in the war's final months while maintaining civilian prosperity possessed advantages that courage and skill could not overcome. The German tank. Crews who had mocked American armor learned that lesson in the most direct way possible, through defeat, death, and the smoking ruins of their Panthers and Tigers. Those who survived carried the knowledge forward into a post-war world where Germany would never again field offensive armor, where Wehrmacht veterans met in quiet halls and remembered not their victories but their final defeats, where the gap between propaganda and reality was measured in graveyards and destroyed cities. The Pershing had driven straight through their lines, through their defenses, through their mythology, through every comfortable lie they had told themselves about German superiority and Allied weakness. And what it revealed, in that moment of violent penetration, was truth. Simple, brutal, undeniable truth about industrial capacity and strategic reality. That truth persisted long after the last Pershing was mothballed, long after survivors like Richter had died, taking their memories with them. It lived in the historical record, in after-action reports and technical evaluations, in the simple fact that American industry had produced a heavy tank equal to German heavy tanks when doctrine demanded it. But more than that, it lived in the understanding that modern war was systemic war, won by economies and logistics rather than individual courage or tactical genius. The Pershing taught that lesson to an entire generation of military planners, not through abstract study but through demonstrated capability on contested battlefields. And somewhere in that lesson, in the space between what German soldiers expected and what American industry delivered, lay a larger truth about freedom and abundance, about what democratic systems could achieve when fully mobilized. The Pershing was steel and tungsten, optics and armor plate, but it was also proof, tangible, lethal proof, that free societies could outfight tyrannies not despite their freedom, but because of it, that economic systems built on market principles and civilian prosperity created industrial capacity that centrally planned economies could not match, that the arsenal of democracy was not merely a phrase, but an accurate description of unprecedented, productive power. The German tank crews who watched those first Pershings emerge from the tree line could not have articulated such abstractions in that moment of shock and combat. They saw only tanks, new tanks, dangerous tanks that violated everything intelligence had promised about American armor. But what they felt, the sudden cold comprehension that their advantages had evaporated, that the war was truly lost, that every sacrifice since 1939 had been in service of lies and mythology. That feeling captured something essential about the Pershing's significance. It was the moment when comfortable illusions died, when propaganda met reality and vaporized, when soldiers understood that they had never possessed the superiority they believed in, and that defeat had always been inevitable once industrial capacity became the deciding factor. In the end, The Pershing drove straight through German lines because nothing could stop it. Not courage, not skill, not tactical excellence, not ideological fervor. The only things that mattered were armor thickness and gun penetration, engine power and supply logistics, all the mundane technical factors that reflected industrial capacity and economic strength. And in every one of those factors, by 1945, America held decisive advantages. The Pershing was simply the vehicle that delivered that message to German tank crews in language they could not ignore. The crack of its gun, the spark of German rounds deflecting from its armor, the burning hulks of panthers that had expected easy victories and found only death. That message echoed through history, carried forward by survivors and historians, by after-action reports and technical manuals, by the simple documented fact that American industry had produced a tank equal to Germany's best when military necessity demanded it. It was a message about systems and capacity, about the relationship between economic organization and military power, about what happened when industrial might met ideological certainty on the battlefield. And the message was clear, written in smoke and blood across the Belgian mud. Abundance wins, industry prevails, mythology shatters against steel, and democratic systems mobilized for war possess advantages that autocratic regimes cannot match, no matter how efficiently organized or ideologically pure they claim to be. The German tank crews had mocked the new American armor. Then it drove straight through their lines, through their defenses, through their mythology, and into history. Not as a war-winning weapon, but as a symbol of American industrial capacity, democratic resilience, and the cold, hard truth that modern war was won in factories long before the first shot was fired.